Today I'm going to tell you a story so raw it leaves you breathless, set deep in the frozen American West, where silence can kill faster than gunfire. This is a land of blizzards, broken men, and choices that decide who lives through the night. It all began with a single sound in the snow. Small, almost easy to ignore, but powerful enough to change 3 lives forever. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cold had been sitting on the land for 3 straight days, heavy and unyielding, the kind that sank into bone and stayed there. Brant Hale had seen winters like this before, back when he rode scout for the army, seasons that snapped stronger men in half. He learned early that routine was the only thing that kept death from getting close. At 38, with a ruined leg and a cabin far from any mine road, he couldn't afford to miss a trap line or let hunger creep in unnoticed. He left the cabin before dusk, the mule hitched to the narrow sled he used for pelts and small game. He didn't speak to the animal. It wasn't that kind of companion. Still, he kept a gloved hand close to its neck as they crossed the packed snow near the cottonwoods. The sun slipped behind the ridge, draining the last color from the sky. Brant read the land the way other men read paper maps. His thoughts stayed practical. How much meat could he stack against the wall? How long would the lantern oil last if the creek snares had caught anything before the storm sealed the world shut? Wind tore across the flat, snapping his coat against his legs. He wasn't prone to panic, but storms out here could turn savage without warning, and he never stayed exposed longer than necessary. The mule's breath rolled out in thick white clouds. Leather creaked. Ice cracked underfoot. That was it. Brant hadn't come out to save anyone. He wasn't hunting trouble either. The traps were there to buy him another month without town. Town meant questions, drunk men, and memories. His wife had died out here 3 winters earlier, bleeding out during childbirth. The baby never took a breath. He buried them both before the ground froze solid and learned to keep his words to himself, unless he was trading hides, powder, or beans. Solitude wasn't fate. It was a choice. Halfway along the creek, he dropped to one knee beside a sprung trap. Something had set it off, but nothing stayed caught. He checked the teeth, reset the trigger, wiped his knife clean, and moved on. Work kept the mind quiet. Steps measured. Breaths counted. That was how regret stayed buried. By the time he reached the cedar outcrop where the creek bent south, the sky had turned slate gray. The wind shifted pitch. The mule flicked an ear and stopped, shifting its weight. Brant raised the lantern, eyes narrowing. No coyotes, no birds, just wind, and something wrong inside it. An unnatural stillness, like the land holding its breath. Then he heard it. Not loud, not clear. A harsh, broken rasp he couldn't place at first. His gut tightened. Sounds like that in snow usually meant something dying. He hated letting anything suffer, man or animal, but stopping could cost him his own life if the storm turned fast. Leave it and go, or look and drag death home with you. He made the choice before finishing the thought. He tied the mule's lead to a bent cottonwood root and climbed the slope beyond the cedars. The lantern cut a thin tunnel through the dark and revealed shapes that didn't belong. 2 figures lay half-buried against a rock ledge, wind-packed snow crusted over them, hair frozen stiff, clothing torn and rigid. For a heartbeat, nothing moved, and frustration hit him hard. Bodies meant responsibility, work, memories. Then one of them stirred. The older woman blinked slowly, lips split and colorless. She didn't flinch when he crouched near. Her eyes were dulled by cold, but still sharp, still watching. He recognized the features immediately. Apache. Dark hair, bronze skin under frost. Someone raised to survive things most people never faced. The younger one didn't move at all. Her hair was blown across her face and frozen there. Brant set the lantern down and pressed a gloved hand to her neck. A pulse answered him. Faint, fragile, but there. Alive. Ice cold, but not gone. He didn't ask how they ended up there. The answer wouldn't change anything. He tore the blankets off the sled and worked with numb fingers to free them from the snow. The older tried to help once, but her arms shook and fell uselessly. He ignored the broken sound she made when he lifted her, more breath than voice, and carried them one at a time back to the sled. He wrapped them tight, covered them with his coat, and tied the blankets down against the wind. The mule stamped and tossed its head, but didn't fight the load. Snow stung Brant's face as the storm thickened. Pain bloomed deep in his leg, where the old bullet lived beneath scar tissue. He didn't slow. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low. Cold scorched his lungs. He hauled the younger woman in first, her body stiff in his arms, then returned for the older. There was no time for modesty. He stripped away frozen cloth and shredded deerskin moccasins, peeled off stiff leggings, and wrapped them both in dry blankets near the stove. He spoke once, quietly, to no one else. Breathe. Breathe. Branthale checked their hands and feet, pressing carefully, watching for signs the flesh might be lost, or whether color would return. The older woman watched him through half-lidded eyes. What he saw there wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, edged with warning. The look of someone making it clear she wasn't helpless, only drained. He fed the stove with dry wood stacked behind the door, flames climbing back to life. He hung their frozen clothing from a ceiling beam and listened to meltwater drip into a tin pan below. Brant kept his coat off as warmth finally reached him, steam rising from his shirt. His thoughts drifted to the grave beneath the cottonwood behind the cabin. The child he hadn't saved. The decision he'd failed to make. Maybe that was why he hadn't turned away tonight. He didn't voice any of it. Instead, he settled onto the stool by the stove and watched for proof of life beyond breathing. The older woman wrapped an arm around her sister, pulling her close. She winced once, but made no sound. The younger girl shivered beneath the blankets, body jerking in short spasms, but color slowly crept back into her face. Brant reminded himself he wasn't planning to keep them. They were strangers. They were trouble. Out here, men were killed for less than sheltering 2 Apache women beneath a white man's roof. Yet he didn't move them, didn't shove them back into the storm. As long as they were breathing, his purpose, if anyone ever asked, was survival. Traps, fire, shelter, silence. Nothing more. Helping them didn't fit that code. But survival also meant facing what was in front of you instead of pretending it wasn't there. Outside, the storm slammed the shutters hard enough to make the nails groan. Inside, heat pressed tight against the walls, mixed with the wet scent of thawing hide. Brant watched the flames climb the stove and listened to the slow, uneven breathing behind him. His pulse eased, but he stayed upright. He didn't sleep. They were alive, which meant tomorrow demanded choices. By dawn, the storm had broken. The cold hadn't. It still burned the lungs. Brant hadn't truly slept, only dozed against the wall beside the stove, waking every few minutes to shifting logs or the faint rasp of breath beneath his blankets. Once during the night, the fire dipped low, and he rebuilt it before frost could reclaim the room. He wasn't about to haul 2 half-frozen souls out of the snow just to watch them slip away. When pale light crept through the frost-clouded window, He leaned close to study their faces in the fire glow. The younger one, Nayli, though he didn't know her name yet, had sweat on her brow. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her lips weren't blue anymore. Her breathing sounded wet, but steady. The older woman had curled herself around her sister through the night, sharing warmth. She watched Brant when he bent closer. Not startled. Not grateful. Just tracking. "You drink," he said quietly. "You stay alive." His voice came out low and worn. She didn't reply, but her gaze flicked toward the iron kettle. Brant filled a tin cup with warmed snowmelt and knelt beside them. Nayli's hand twitched when he touched her shoulder. He slid an arm behind her and lifted her just enough to tip the cup to her lips. Water spilled down her chin, but she swallowed. Her eyes opened a narrow slit, studying him as if unsure he was real. The older woman pushed herself onto one elbow and reached out for the cup. He handed it to her without hesitation. Her fingers trembled as she drank. Not fear, but hunger and shock loosening their grip. Neither of them had spoken. They were Apache. He'd known the moment he saw their braids, the beadwork clinging to torn cloth. He'd worked with Apache scouts once. Fought others later, down along the Rio Grande. He didn't carry clean opinions anymore. All that mattered was this. They were alive because he'd found them, and now they were under his roof. That carried weight whether he welcomed it or not. He fed the fire again and pulled on his boots. The mule would need tending. The barn door had drifted shut during the night. His muscles ached from hauling bodies through snow, and his bad leg throbbed with that deep, familiar pull. Chores didn't wait. Before stepping outside, he paused and addressed the older woman again. "Move slow," he said. "Fire stays. Water's there." He pointed to the jug by the stove. She followed his gesture, then looked back at him. No nod, no sound. But she understood. Outside, the world lay silent and white. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, nearly halfway up the barn door. The sky was pale blue, windless. Every tree stood locked in ice. Brant cleared a path with the flat edge of an old feed scoop, opened the barn, and led the mule to the trough. The ranch horses stamped and snorted, tails twitching after the long, bitter night. The water in the trough had frozen solid. Brant Hale shattered the crust with the back of the scoop, then carried a pail of hot water from the stove. When he stepped back inside, the older woman had shifted. She sat upright against the wall now, blanket wrapped tight from chest to feet, watching the room. Exhaustion dulled her movements, but her eyes stayed sharp. Her sister still slept, breathing quieter, no longer trembling the way she had before. Brant set the pail near the door and paused, studying them. He needed to know how they'd ended up on his trap line, how long they'd been running. Someone might come looking. He didn't want riders showing up days from now, following blood or broken signs in the snow. He crouched by the stove and spoke evenly. "You get close to anyone?" The woman met his gaze and said nothing. He tried again. "Someone chasing you?" No flinch, no blink, just that unreadable stare. He thought of the rules he'd lived by for years. No strangers, no guests, no stories. The night had already broken them. He pressed once more, sharper this time. "If they find this place, we all die out here." That reached her. Her jaw tightened. She glanced down at her sister, then back at him. She still didn't speak, but something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, understanding. Brant stood and pulled his coat from the peg. "I'll get food," he said. "Don't move her yet." She gave a single, slow blink. It was the closest thing to agreement he was going to get. He stepped back into the cold and crossed to the storage shed dug into the slope behind the cabin. Ice clung to the latch. He broke it free and gathered what remained: smoked deer meat and a small sack of cornmeal. Enough for a week if rationed. Less now, with 3 mouths. The weight of that settled on him, but he didn't turn back. Inside, he set a skillet on the stove, tearing meat into strips, adding water and a pinch of ground chili. The smell spread slowly. The younger sister stirred. Her eyes opened fully this time, darting from blankets to fire, then to him. She looked at her sister, and her breathing eased. The older woman brushed her cheek and whispered a single word, too soft for Brant to catch. The girl relaxed and slipped back into shallow sleep. Brant realized then what anyone hearing the story would ask. Who were these women? How long had they been trapped in the snow? Why were they alone, unarmed, with no trail behind them? And why had a man like him, one who avoided people, dragged them inside instead of letting the cold take them? His thoughts returned to that sound in the dark, and the way the older woman's eyes had stayed open even when her body was failing. Something in that had moved his legs before his mind caught up. He didn't regret it, but he knew it would weigh on the days ahead. He set bowls on the floor beside them and spoke plainly. When she wakes for good, feed her slow. If she gets sick, wait before more. The older woman nodded once. Real understanding showed at last. She didn't thank him. He hadn't expected it. Brant cut 2 small strips of meat for himself and ate standing, watching the door, the window, and the rise and fall of their breathing all at once. There was one more thing that needed saying. You're safe here, for now. If men come, I'll know before they reach the creek. And I won't run. The older sister watched him closely. Her hand rested near her leg beneath the blanket, as if she wished a blade waited there. He saw no fear, only calculation. He didn't ask their names. Not yet. He didn't give his. But the cabin no longer felt the same as it had the night before. And Brant knew the quiet wouldn't last. By midday, the fire had burned low. He dragged 2 more logs from the stack by the wall and broke apart another slat from the old bunk frame he never used. The room still held warmth, but only if he kept feeding it. Every movement he made, the older sister followed with her eyes. While he'd been outside, she'd shifted from the floor, sitting upright against the wall with both blankets wrapped tight, her sister tucked under her arm. Her posture said she was ready to move if she had to. Given their condition, he'd expected questions, fear, anger. Instead, they stayed silent, alert. And that silence made him wonder again what had driven them into the storm. Apache families didn't abandon their own without reason, not in weather like this, and men didn't haul captives through a blizzard unless they meant to use them or kill them. Sooner or later someone would ask, were they fleeing white men? Other bands? Soldiers? Why no weapons? Why only the 2 of them? Why no trail behind them but what the wind erased? Anyone would want answers. And so would he, once the younger woman was awake, fevered but alive. When her eyes opened again, she tried to sit up on her own. Brant Hale moved toward her slowly and crouched at a distance that wouldn't startle either of them. The older sister shifted at once, lifting her head in warning, but she didn't pull the girl away. Brant kept his voice even, the same steady tone he'd used since the night before. She needs warm water. Fever breaks faster when there's heat in her. He nodded toward the small tin mug near the stove. Asha never took her eyes off him as she reached for it, testing the temperature with the back of her hand. She lifted Nayli's head and let her drink. Nayli coughed once and swallowed, shoulders trembling beneath the blanket, but the water stayed down. Outside, the mule shifted and stamped, restless from cold or impatience. Brant stood and pulled his coat on again. Before stepping out, he looked directly at Asha. "If you can stand, keep your toes moving. Frostbite comes fast when blood stops." "Same for her." Asha understood. He could see it in the way she shifted beneath the blankets, flexing her feet even though the pain tightened her jaw. She glanced at her sister's hands and rubbed them gently through the wool. Outside, the sky had cleared. Bright, deceptive. The kind of cold that looked harmless and killed men by nightfall. Brant checked the traps nearest the barn first. The storm had erased most sign, but one snare held a rabbit. Frozen stiff. Meat was meat. He carried it inside and laid it on the table, then went back out to check the creek traps. The wind had settled, but his eyes never stopped moving, scanning tree lines and low draws for any sign of passage. He found none. No tracks, no smoke, no movement, only ice sealing the creek and drifts where water once ran open. When he returned, both women were awake and sharper than before. Nayli, still weak, had edged closer to the stove. Asha sat upright now, knees drawn beneath the blanket, back straight despite the pain in her limbs. Brant noticed she'd dragged the kettle closer and set another tin cup beside it. They were conserving heat without being told. That told him enough. He skinned the rabbit at the table, dropping the hide into a bucket and cutting the meat into strips. The scrape of blade on wood drew their attention, but neither flinched. Nayli watched openly now, her eyes clearer than before. When she coughed, it came from deep in her chest, not her throat, and she winced as if something inside still burned. Brant checked their feet with his eyes while pretending not to. Red, raw, painful, but no blackening. They'd likely keep everything. He cooked the rabbit with cornmeal in the same skillet he'd used earlier. When he motioned for Asha to eat first, she hesitated only a breath, then split the portion and passed the larger share to her sister. They ate in silence, careful and focused, swallowing slowly so their stomachs wouldn't turn after so long without food. When the bowls were empty, Brant asked the one question that couldn't wait until nightfall. "Anyone coming for you? Anyone at all?" Asha lifted her chin slightly and shook her head once. Firm. Certain. Nayli watched them both, saying nothing. Brant lowered his voice. "Men drive you into the snow?" For a moment, neither moved. Then Asha reached for her sister's wrist, grounding her. She didn't speak. Either she couldn't, or she chose not to. She raised her free hand, mimed a rifle firing once, then pointed west with 2 fingers. After that, she touched her shoulder where a scar hid beneath the blanket. That was enough. Gunfire. Someone from the west. A wound taken while running. No band following. No camp left behind. Brant didn't press further, pushing only hardened wounds that were already deep. He stood and checked the door beam, then the window latch, making sure both were secure. As he moved through the room, he knew what anyone would be wondering. Would he keep them here? Would he send them away once the weather broke? Would riders come looking for 2 Apache women? Would he fight? Would they? Before any of it could be spoken, he gave the only answer he could live with. "You stay until you can stand without falling. After that, we'll see." He didn't promise safety beyond the walls. He didn't ask their names again. Still, something in the room shifted. Asha's shoulders eased, not in comfort, but in acknowledgement. Nayli closed her eyes the way someone does when they finally release a breath they've been holding too long. Brant sat back on the stool, his spine against the wall, eyes fixed on the door. The daylight looked clean and harmless, but night would fall fast. Brant Hale planned to keep the fire fed, check their feet again by lantern light, and listen for sounds riding the wind that didn't belong. Survival wasn't something he planned anymore. It lived in his body. And now it counted 3 lives, not 1. Morning came without wind. The cold, however, had settled deeper than before. Frost traced the inside edges of the window, and the stove had burned down to pale ash. Brant was already awake, boots on, shoulders stiff from sleeping upright against the wall. He added kindling and 2 heavy logs before the women stirred. The younger one slept deeper now, no longer thrashing or shaking the way she had that first night. The older sister kept half her face uncovered, watching him while pretending to rest. He stepped outside only long enough to relieve himself, break the ice in the ranch horse's trough, and haul another armful of wood from the stack beneath the lean-to. The sky was a flat, brittle blue, so dry his breath scraped his throat like chalk. No fresh tracks near the barn, no circling birds, no distant rifle crack. Still, his nerves stayed tight, coiled the same way they'd been since the night he found them. When he came back inside, the older woman had pushed herself upright. Her sister leaned against her side, wrapped in both blankets. Their braids were still stiff with cold, but their skin had lost that dead gray cast. Brant set the wood down carefully and spoke just loud enough to break the silence. "You both need to get blood moving. If you don't stand some today, your feet will blacken." The older woman's eyes flickered. She didn't catch every word, but the tone, and his pointing, made the meaning clear. He poured water from the kettle into 2 tin cups and set them on the floor near them, backing away to give space. The younger woman, Nayli, though he still didn't know her name, blinked awake when steam brushed her nose. She swallowed and rested her head against her sister's shoulder. Asha lifted the cup and let her drink first. There was something else that needed saying, something heavy he'd left untouched. The risk of keeping them. The chance someone might come looking. The fear that shelter could turn them into targets. Brant kept his voice low and even. "If the man who shot you is alive, I need to know if he'll come this way. Tracks get buried, but they don't vanish. This cabin isn't invisible." Asha studied him for a long moment. Then she made a short, cutting motion at her side. Final. She jabbed 2 fingers toward the door, then flattened her palm and pressed it to the floor. It wasn't perfect language. It was enough. Whoever chased them was dead, or far away. The trail ended before this place. No one else was coming. Not anyone who cared. Not anyone who meant well. That answered the question hanging since the start. They weren't being followed. Not yet. Good. Brant set his rifle near the door, where it always rested, and pulled the skillet from the shelf. He had just enough cornmeal for 1 more mash before supplies thinned out. He added water, tore off a narrow strip of dried venison, and stirred it over the flame. While it cooked, he spoke without turning. "You're not prisoners, but don't open that door unless I say so. Storm or no storm, there are wolves out there. And worse than wolves." Asha didn't respond, but her eyes went to the latch, then to the rifle. She understood the rules. Nayli coughed, soft, deep. Brant knelt close enough to check her hands and feet again. The skin was raw, painful, but color still held. She winced, but didn't pull away when he pressed gently at the worst cracks. He didn't ask permission. There wasn't time for it. He felt Asha watching every movement his hands made. When the food was ready, he slid the plates toward them and took his own portion to the table. He ate standing, 1 hip against the wood, watching how they handled the meal. They ate slowly, giving Nayli most of the broth. The way Asha held her shoulders made him suspect she understood more English than she let on. He tested the thought without pressing. "You got names?" he asked simply. Both women went still, not afraid, but weighing something. Asha studied his face for a long moment. Then she spoke one word. Dry, rough, steady. Asha. He nodded once and pointed slightly toward the younger woman. Asha hesitated, then brushed her sister's arm. Nayli. Nayli lifted her eyes when her name was spoken. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away. Brant didn't give his name. Not yet. He wasn't sure if that would help or complicate things. Instead, he gave them the truth they needed. You stay until you can walk. After that, if you leave, I won't stop you. If you stay, you work the same as me. Asha didn't nod. She didn't answer. But the tightness in her shoulders eased, just a fraction. At last, Brant Hale gave them the one thing they would need either way. That's my name. Nayli blinked slowly, testing the sound, as if it carried weight. Asha didn't repeat it, but the tension in her jaw eased, like a question she'd held since the night before had finally settled. Brant addressed the unspoken doubt hanging in the room, whether he feared them or believed they might turn on him. I've lived long enough with scouts and raiders to know the difference, he said flatly. If you meant me harm, you'd have done it when I took your boots off. So we won't sit here watching each other like enemies, unless something changes. Asha glanced at the stove, then back at him. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't resistance either. The day passed in quiet labor. Outside, Brant split wood, fixed the loose slat on the barn hinge, and restacked the sled. Inside, Asha helped Nayli to her feet twice, bracing her under the arms while her legs trembled beneath her weight. Nayli's breath caught with pain, but she didn't cry out. When Brant stepped back inside and saw them standing, even briefly, something settled in him. They weren't guests, they were survivors, and survival worked better when roles were clear. He added another log to the stove and checked the rifle's hammer before evening fell. No tracks marked the snow. No riders cut the horizon. The quiet held for now, but the cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one man. Whatever came next, life wouldn't return to what it had been before they arrived. By the third morning, the air inside carried the thick scent of wood smoke, damp hides drying near the stove, and bodies clawing their way back from cold. Brant woke before dawn, not by choice, but by habit. His coat was still on from the night, his back stiff from sleeping half upright in the chair. The fire had burned low. He fed it carefully, easing the heat back so it wouldn't make the women cough or faint. Nayli breathed easier now, though a deep rattle still lingered in her chest. He knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers lightly at her neck, checking her pulse. Asha's eyes opened at the movement. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak, but her shoulders tightened the way they did when memory brushed too close. She's warm enough, Brant said quietly, but that cough stays. She needs broth and rest. Asha didn't respond, but her jaw softened. Nayli stirred, trying to turn onto her side. Brant adjusted the blanket without touching bare skin. The stove crackled behind him, filling the silence. Anyone listening would have questions by now. How long the women had gone without food, whether they'd lost family when their camp fell, whether the wound on Asha's shoulder told only part of the story. And the other question, the one none of them spoke, whether the fever might still take Nayli. Now that frostbite had loosened its grip, Brant shaped the morning around that risk. He set water to boil and added what remained of the smoked rabbit bones and a handful of ground corn. It wasn't much, but he didn't feed himself first. Resentment never rose. Only the clear understanding that supplies wouldn't last more than a week if the storm locked them in. After stoking the fire, he dragged the spare cot from storage and set it closer to the stove. He stripped his own blankets from the bunk and laid them across the frame, so Nayli wouldn't have to sleep on bare wood. Asha watched, brow creased as if weighing whether a price would follow. "I didn't drag her out of the snow to lose her to cold inside," Brant said. "If she stands better off the ground, we use the cot." Asha moved slowly, helping Nayli sit upright. The younger woman's leg shook, but her color was stronger today. Brant offered his arm, not gripping, just close enough for balance. Asha hesitated only a moment before guiding Nayli to lean against him. He lifted her in one careful motion and settled her onto the cot, then stepped back without lingering. Nayli's breathing stayed even. Her eyes remained half open, not drifting anymore. Brant could tell she was listening now. He poured broth into a tin bowl and handed it to Asha. She tested the heat and fed Nayli in small spoonfuls. The girl swallowed without choking. Brant released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The next concern came before it could turn dangerous: water, washing, infection. Anyone would wonder whether frostbitten skin had been cleaned, whether the wound in Asha's shoulder risked rot. He pointed to the metal basin near the stove. "When she's finished eating, I'll heat water. That wound needs cleaning. Infection kills faster than hunger in this cold." Asha's gaze flicked to her shoulder, then back to his face. She didn't refuse. She didn't agree either. Brant didn't push. Instead, Brant Hale gathered clean strips of cloth from the small trunk beside his bunk, old shirts he'd cut down over the years for binding wounds. He laid them out on the table where Asha could see them clearly. Nothing hidden. Nothing sudden. When the broth was finished, he filled the metal basin with hot water and set it near the stove. He waited. Asha moved first. She loosened her dress with one steady hand and pulled the fabric clear of the scabbed wound on her shoulder. Brant stayed a few steps back, close enough to catch her if she swayed, far enough not to crowd her. The injury wasn't new. The graze had hardened into a scab, but swelling darkened the edges, bruising spreading toward her back. A rifle shot, fired from distance, likely while she was running. "You clean it," Brant said evenly, nodding toward Nayli. "She helps. I bring cloth when you're ready. If it opens, I stop the bleeding." Nothing more. Asha paused, then gave a single nod. Brant stepped away, giving them space, and checked the rifle by the door, wiping moisture from the barrel, testing the sights out of habit. When he returned with the cloth, Asha had already washed most of the dried blood away. Nayli held the blanket tight around her sister's back, hands steady despite her weakness. Brant offered the cloth without reaching toward them. Asha took it and bound the shoulder with slow, practiced movements. Not careful in a delicate way, but firm, controlled, the kind that kept strain from pulling a wound open. She'd done this before. The warmth inside the cabin grew stronger. Asha tested her legs, rising without bracing against the wall. She managed a few careful steps before gripping the chair for balance. Brant pointed toward the bench beneath the window. "Sit there a bit. Muscles work better on wood than dirt." She didn't thank him, but she followed the direction. The afternoon passed in quiet labor, the kind that answered questions without words. Brant stepped outside with his rifle and checked the ridge trail and the tree line above the creek. From that rise, he could see 1/2 mile of snow and bare rock. No riders, no smoke, no tracks larger than rabbit prints near the brush. Whoever had chased these women wasn't close enough to leave a mark. Back inside, Nayli slept without moaning, her breathing steady. Asha sat upright, blanket over her lap, eyes tracking Brant whenever he crossed the room. Her suspicion hadn't vanished, but it had changed shape. Less sharp, more deliberate. As evening settled, Brant boiled water again and set more cornmeal to cook, cutting the portions smaller than before. By tomorrow, he'd need to slice strips from stored deer hide to make the food stretch. Before the lamps dimmed, he spoke to Asha, answering a question no one had asked, but anyone would carry. "I knew someone once," he said quietly, fixing the door latch with practiced hands. "I buried her after the snow took her. I don't bury another if I can stop it." Asha stared at him for a long moment. Brant didn't meet her eyes. He added another log to the fire and settled near the door with the rifle across his knees. Whatever doubt still lingered, the air around it had shifted. Nayli was alive. Asha was on her feet, and Brant had made it clear, without asking anything in return, that he didn't plan to push them back into the cold once their legs could hold weight. Night fell, but the silence no longer carried the same distance between them. The fourth morning broke under a clear sky, snow crusted hard enough to crack beneath a boot. Brant stepped outside before the sun crested the ridge, pulling the cabin door tight behind him. Cold bit through the seams of his coat, but his footing held firm. He checked the lean-to first. No fresh animal tracks. The mule chewed slowly. The ranch horses were restless but sound. The storm had scrubbed most sign from the land, but his instincts hadn't dulled. He scanned the tree line twice, then circled the cabin, watching for any mark left overnight. Nothing. Inside, the stove still breathed warmth from the coal bed he'd banked before sleeping. Asha was awake, not startled, just alert. Her blanket wrapped at the waist. Nayli sat up as well, coughing softly into her hands. The sound was still deep, but no longer tearing at her lungs the way it had before. Brant set the rifle by the door and went straight to the stove. He poured what remained of last night's broth into 2 tin cups, added water and a scrap of rabbit fat, then set it back over the flame. Supplies were nearly gone. Meat wouldn't last more than another day. Cornmeal was down to dust. If the weather held, he'd need to hunt. But he wasn't leaving the cabin unguarded with 2 half-healed women inside. Some would wonder why he hadn't gone to town. The answer was simple. No town within 30 miles would shelter 2 Apache women, and no lawman would ask questions before deciding they were trouble best removed. Brant filled a mug and motioned to Asha first. She tested the heat, passed it to Nayli, then drank herself. Both swallowed without hesitation. Hunger had burned away hesitation. Sitting on the stool, Brant Hale finally asked what he'd left untouched for too long. "You had people before this," he said. "Family, camp, someone besides each other." Asha met his eyes. She didn't answer right away. It wasn't refusal. It was restraint, as if she were weighing what could be spoken without tearing something open inside herself. Then she lifted 2 fingers, pointed west again, and swept her hand downward, flattening the air. Gone. All of them. Dead or scattered. Nayli didn't look up. Her fingers twisted slowly into the edge of the blanket. Brant let the silence stand. He understood enough without words. Raiders, settlers, mercenaries, men who broke Apache families apart for profit, fear, or sport, dressed up as righteousness. He'd ridden with men like that once. He'd walked away, but the knowledge stayed. "I won't let anyone track this place," he said. "If men come, they don't leave walking." Asha's brow tightened. Not doubt, but calculation. She was deciding whether he meant it. He did. Once the cups were empty, Brant split the morning's work. He nodded to Nayli. "You stay by the fire. Feet on the floor, not tucked in. Blood has to move." She understood enough, sliding her legs from beneath the blanket and wincing when they touched the cold wood. To Asha, he said, "You walk her inside, 10 steps at a time. If she stays down, she loses more later." Asha didn't argue. Nayli stood slowly, steadying herself on the table. Pain tightened her face, but she moved, dragging the blanket behind her like a shawl. Brant pulled on his coat and lifted the trap bag from the peg. He wasn't going far, just to the first line of snares near the brush. Before leaving, he addressed what still lingered. Trust. "I'm leaving the rifle here," he said, pointing to where it rested near the door. "If trouble comes, bolt the door and light the lamp. Fire one shot. I'll hear it." Asha's eyes went to the rifle, then back to him. It was a strange offer by any measure, a white man leaving a firearm within reach of 2 Apache women he'd just met. But Brant read the room clearly. If they wanted him dead, he'd never have woken by the fire. He closed the door and moved across the snow toward the brush line near the creek, following the mule's packed path where the crust held firm. 3 snares were empty. The 4th held a snowshoe hare, still alive but trapped by the leg. He snapped its neck clean and dropped it into the bag. On the way back, he scanned the ridge again, watching for smoke, tracks, or a glint of metal. There was nothing. Only white and stillness. Inside the cabin, Asha sat on the cot beside Nayli. Both watched the door as it opened. No fear, only readiness. Brant skinned the hare over a basin, laid the hide out to dry, and cut what meat could be saved. The bones he set aside for stew. The rest he salted lightly and placed on a tin pan near the stove. With food handled for the moment, he turned to the next need. Clothes. Their dresses were torn past real use. Blankets wouldn't hold if they had to move outside. He dragged a crate from beneath his bunk and pulled out 2 old shirts, a spare wool coat missing buttons, and a pair of leggings taken from a dead prospector years ago. He set the clothes on the table, not as charity, but as tools. "They don't fit," he said, "but they'll cover skin until I cut better ones." Asha studied the garments without touching them. Nayli reached out slowly and brushed her fingers across the wool sleeve. Brant pretended not to notice as he took his knife and began trimming the larger shirt down, leaving room for stitching once Asha's hands steadied enough to do it herself. Hunger and exhaustion had dulled suspicion. Survival spoke louder than memory. As afternoon light slanted through the frost-clouded window, Brant finally voiced what had hovered between every silent exchange since they met. "When you can both stand and walk distance," he said, "we decide whether you stay here or find another place." He didn't say when. He didn't force which. He named the choice because leaving it unspoken would make it feel like a sentence. Nayli swallowed without coughing now. Asha held her shoulders straight, listening without answering. Brant cleaned the knife, fed the fire, and checked the door the way he always did before dark. The cabin felt different now. Still quiet, still small, but no longer hollow the way it had been before he found them in the snow. Outside, the sky showed no storm yet. Inside the cabin, a different kind of silence settled, one that wasn't hiding anything, only waiting. Brant Hale could feel it. Whatever choices came next would not resemble the life he'd planned before dragging them out of the snow. That was why, by the 5th morning, the place no longer felt like it held strangers. It wasn't familiar. Not yet. But the sharp edge of fear and guessing had worn down on all 3 sides. He woke to the sound of careful coughing. Nayli sat upright on the cot, covered to the waist. Her breathing was still rough, but it no longer snagged the way it had before. Asha sat beside her, legs tucked beneath the blanket, her hair unbraided for the first time, drawn close to the stove's warmth. Brant fed the fire and quietly counted what remained. 2 salted rabbits laid out on tin, 3 small handfuls of cornmeal, a few stripped bones set aside for broth. Not enough to last another 3 days. And if Asha and Nayli were strong enough to help themselves, they were strong enough to eat more than ration scraps. That meant planning. He spoke while setting the kettle on the stove. When the sun climbs, I'll hunt farther out. I won't be gone long. Keep the door barred unless it's me. Asha listened without comment. Nayli drank from the tin cup and lowered it slowly, swallowing easier than the day before. Her eyes followed Brant now with less haze, more awareness of where she was. Before leaving, he addressed what had lingered too long between them. Not curiosity, necessity. I need to know, he said plainly. How many came after you, and why? Asha didn't answer at first. Her shoulders tightened as she weighed what could be given without reopening wounds. Then she raised 3 fingers, lowered one, paused, lowered another. One left. She pointed west again, farther this time, past the ridge, beyond the cottonwoods. Brant understood. 3 had come. 2 were dead, by their hands or someone else's. 1 still lived somewhere behind them. Not close, not near enough to follow tracks buried beneath miles of snow. Nayli's gaze dropped at the memory. Her fingers curled tight into the blanket. Brant looked at her once, then back to Asha. If he finds this cabin, he dies before he reaches the step. It wasn't a promise. It was fact. Asha held his eyes. For the first time since they crossed the threshold, something in her posture eased. Not trust, but belief that he meant what he said. After breakfast, thin stew and the last of the cornmeal, Brant pulled on his coat and took his rifle. He pointed to its twin resting against the far wall beside the stacked hides. If someone comes, he said, you use that. It kicks hard. Brace your shoulder. Fire once. Asha followed his gesture from rifle to Nayli, then back to him. She understood what it meant to be handed a weapon, and what it said about how he judged them. Brant shut the door behind him, boots crunching over frozen snow. The sun hadn't yet burned off the morning frost. The land showed no tracks but his own and the mules. He moved along the ridge trail, resetting snares, scanning for fresh sign. Rabbit, deer, fox, anything to buy another day. Back at the cabin, Asha used the quiet to do what she hadn't been able to before. She cleaned the basin, gathered the cloths, and rebound her shoulder with steady hands. Nayli pulled on one of the cut shirts Brant had left, sleeves falling past her hands, hem brushing her thighs. The altered wool coat lay folded on the cot, waiting. Anyone watching might have wondered by now whether they meant to stay past recovery, or whether Brant wanted that, or merely allowed it. But by the time he returned with 2 rabbits and a grouse taken clean through the neck, that question had already shifted. He stepped inside and found Nayli standing near the stove, one hand braced on the table. Her balance wavered, but her legs held. Brant leaned the rifle against the wall and laid the game on the table. Asha moved to help without being asked, pulling a knife from the shelf and spreading the hide cloth he'd used the day before. You cut, Brant said, showing her the line along the grouse's breastbone. Bones boil longer, meat stretches dried. Asha nodded once and worked with calm precision. Nayli watched, then reached for one of the rabbits, copying the motion carefully, cutting close to bone, peeling the hide back. Brant said nothing, but his eyes stayed on her hands in case she slipped. With the meat sorted and the pot set again, he spoke to the last concern still unvoiced. Tomorrow, if the sky holds, I take one of you to the creek edge. Packed snow. Not both. One at a time. Asha looked at him sharply. Not refusal, but calculation. Tracks fade fast on crust like this, he added. If you can stand outside the cabin by next week, no one follows you in or out. He didn't say the rest, that trapping them indoors wasn't survival. And if they stayed, they'd have to know the land as well as he did. The quiet held. Then Nayli's voice broke it, for the first time since she'd spoken her name. "I walk," she said. The words came out rough, scraped raw by cold and sickness, but they were clear. Asha turned toward her at once, startled by the sound. Brant Hale didn't correct her. He didn't argue. "You walk when your lungs stop burning," he replied evenly. "Today you sit and eat." Night settled in slow and heavy, colder than before but without the same vicious bite. Brant set the doorbeam firm in its slot, checked the rifle locks, and turned the lantern wick down low. Firelight stretched their shadows across the wall, his near the door, Asha seated close to the cot, Nayli lying beneath fresh blankets, awake instead of slipping away. The questions still hanging: where they would go once healed, what Brant expected of them, whether the man who hunted them still breathed. Didn't need answers yet. What mattered was simpler. No one froze. No one starved. No one was left outside again. For the first time since they'd come through his door, Brant didn't sleep in the chair. He unrolled a blanket near the door, rifle close, and lay there with his back to the room. Not because he distrusted them, but because if danger came before morning, it would meet him first. Dawn arrived as a thin band of gold along the ridge, wrapped in a silence so deep it made the cabin feel larger than it was. Brant woke before light touched the window. He rolled his blanket tight and listened. No wind, no movement outside except the slow stamp of the mule beneath the lean-to. Inside, dying coals whispered, and two steady rhythms of breathing filled the room. Asha stirred first. She sat upright on the floor near the cot, hair loose over one shoulder, the scar on her back hidden beneath the coat she'd taken the night before. Nayli woke soon after, blinking slowly. She coughed once, quiet, controlled, and steadied herself on the cot frame. No fever sweat, no deep rattle in her chest. Only soreness, only exhaustion. Brant fed 2 small logs into the stove and spoke without turning. "I eat first, then we go outside." Asha's eyes moved from the fire to the door, then back to him. She didn't ask why, she already knew. If they meant to survive past winter, they couldn't stay folded inside, waiting for food to vanish. They would have to walk, breathe cold air without breaking, learn the ground they stood on. Brant ladled rabbit stew from the night before, thin but hot, into tin bowls. Nayli ate slowly, hands steadier than yesterday. Asha finished without pause. Before stepping out, Brant took his rifle and hatchet and cinched his coat tight. He looked at both of them. Then he spoke to Asha in the same direct tone he'd used from the start. "You stay with her. I check the rise. If I call, you bar the door and pull her behind the stove." Asha didn't answer aloud. She nodded once. Sharp, certain, like someone used to following orders that made sense. Nayli tightened the coat around her shoulders and watched him go with clear eyes. Not the dull haze he'd seen on the first day. Outside, the cold struck his lungs hard, but his breath came steady. Snow had crusted firm overnight. No new tracks, no snapped branches from passing horses. He moved along the ridge trail in a slow arc, checking the high points where sight cut both ways. He scanned the valley, the creek bed, the cottonwoods. No smoke, no riders, no tracks moving in or out. When he returned, he didn't speak at once. He pulled off his gloves and pointed toward Nayli. "You first," he said, "only to the lean-to and back." Asha stepped forward as if to object, but stopped when he added, "She breathes better moving before the cough roots again." Nayli didn't wait. She rose from the cot, wavered for a heartbeat, then reached for Brant's hand. Not for trust, but for balance. He opened the door and let the cold meet her slowly, giving her body time to adjust. Her boots crunched on hardened snow, each step careful, not weak. He walked beside her without holding unless she faltered. She didn't. They reached the lean-to, where the mule chewed lazily and the ranch horses stamped in place. Nelly leaned on the fence rail for a moment, catching her breath, then straightened on her own. Some might wonder whether something deeper than survival had begun to form between them, whether Nelly saw Brant as rescuer, stranger, or something in between. In that moment, there was no expectation, only endurance. They turned back together. Inside, Asha stood by the window, working a strip of hide through her hands again and again to keep her fingers alive. When Nelly stepped in, the tension in Asha's shoulders eased a fraction. She touched her sister's arm, checking for shiver or strain, then looked at Brant. "My turn," she said quietly. The English surprised him. Brant didn't react. He simply opened the door again. Asha walked out without reaching for help. Her shoulder pained her with every step, but she carried it without letting it show. Outside, Brant Hale kept pace a step behind. Asha stopped at the same fence rail, set her palm on the top board, and let the cold fill her lungs. Her eyes traveled the ridge and the tree line, not searching for escape, but measuring danger. When they went back inside, any question about how much she understood answered itself. She'd known enough from the start. Silence had been a choice, not confusion. Strength came first. Brant stacked fresh wood by the door and finally said what had been waiting for days. "When the snow breaks, I take you both down to the low country. There's a trader there who won't fire on sight if he sees you with me. Supplies last longer if we make that run." Asha watched him without fear or refusal. She wrapped both hands around the tin cup she'd used earlier and said nothing. Brant added evenly, "If you try to run before then, you won't make a mile. Frost or men will find you. So you stay here. You follow my rules. You eat what we have. I keep this roof standing. It wasn't a bargain. It was how the world worked beyond those walls." Nelly's voice came again. Quiet, steady. "We stay." Asha didn't argue. She didn't look away either. She laid the strip of hide on the table and sat back down, the tension gone from her shoulders. Brant said nothing more. The cabin settled into something different after that. Not soft, not friendly, but solid. No one was pretending this was temporary anymore. He dressed the rabbit meat and set a snare pole by the door to mark what needed checking next. Asha pulled the coat around Nelly's back and sat beside her. Not as a shield this time, but as someone allowed to rest without fear of being turned out. Night came again, cold with it, but the silence no longer held distance. It held weight, shared. The days that followed arrived without warning or change in rhythm. Snow stayed firm and pale. Wind rose only after dark. The air cut sharp enough to remind the lungs where they were. Brant spoke no more than needed, but his habits shifted without announcement. He cut 2 extra logs each morning instead of 1. He rationed the last of the cornmeal evenly, not by his portion first. He left the rifle within reach of all 3 of them. It wasn't kindness. It was recognition. No one in that cabin was helpless now. Nelly gained strength the fastest. By the 7th night, the rattle in her chest had thinned to a shallow cough, and she no longer shook with each step. She spoke little, only what was needed, but her voice carried clean, and she no longer watched the door like it might break open. Any doubt about lasting harm answered itself the morning she carried the water bucket from the stove to the table without swaying or gasping. Asha's wound closed clean beneath the wrap. The scar pulled when she lifted too high or turned too fast, but Brant checked once more and saw no sign of rot. She didn't thank him. She simply stopped tracking his hands as if every movement carried threat. Trust didn't need naming. With food nearly gone, Brant made the decision everyone knew was coming. He stood by the table with his coat half fastened. The snow breaks in 2 days. When it does, we head east, down the low ridge to the frontier trading camp. I bring back powder, beans, salt, cloth. I don't ask names or reasons. He didn't say what he'd already decided once they reached that camp, that he wouldn't leave them behind or gamble their safety on any man's word. His voice made it plain enough. They were leaving as one unit. Nayli set her cup down and met his eyes. You bring us back here, or leave us there? I bring you back, Brant said without pause. This cabin won't stand empty now. That closed the last question, whether he meant to abandon them once they could walk, whether survival was the end of it. That evening, before the light faded entirely, he took them out again, one at a time, for a longer walk past the lean-to and halfway down the frozen creek bed. Nayli stepped with measured confidence, breath controlled, eyes reading the land, not for escape, but for understanding. Asha followed the creek line with her gaze, marking blind slopes, thickets, distances. Brant led without explanation. He didn't need to. The land would belong to all 3 of them if they learned how to walk it. Inside again, before night set fully, he finished the last thing left undone. A second bunk. He cleared the corner opposite the stove, dragged the old frame from storage, and repaired the slat he'd broken for firewood days earlier. He said nothing about who would sleep there. He laid the last good blanket across it and stepped back. Asha watched him, her face unreadable, then looked to Nayli, who rested on the cot with calmer breath than any night before. Brant took the floor by the door, same as always. This time he set the rifle closer to their side than his own. Before the lamps burned low, Asha spoke. It wasn't a question or a warning, just a line drawn in the quiet. When the snow pulls back more, we help with the traps. We work, she added, not only eat. Brant Hale gave a single nod. If you stay here, you live here. Work's part of it. Nayli traced the edge of the blanket with her fingers, then said softly, We don't leave. Brant looked from her to Asha and let the weight of that choice settle without answering. They weren't staying because they were too weak to go. They were staying because they'd chosen the roof that didn't drive them back into the cold. Night came down the way it always had, quiet, steady, but something final had set in place. There was no longer a question of whether this was temporary or whether Brant would return to solitude once their feet held firm. The storm that had bound them had passed. What followed had been claimed. No ceremony, no vows, no permission asked. By morning, when the first thin line of meltwater cut the ridge path, the 3 of them would leave the cabin together. They wouldn't come back as strangers. They wouldn't face spring as 3 lives crossing by chance. The man who believed he'd buried every remaining piece of himself now carried 2 others under his roof. The women who had lost everything behind them had found the only place that didn't turn them back to the snow. The story didn't end with questions. It ended with ground claimed, breath shared, and 3 lives no longer split by the storm that nearly took them all. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening, and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories, from our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal. Disclaimer: each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.